In the autumn of 1982, in a conference room somewhere within the labyrinth of NATO headquarters, four nations faced a problem that none of them believed they could solve. The representatives sat around a polished table as satellite imagery and intelligence briefings mapped out a situation that had become untenable, a crisis point that demanded action but seemed to offer no viable path to success. The Americans, the Germans, the French, and the Italians had all been asked the same question. Could their special operations forces execute a rescue operation under conditions that seemed to violate every principle of military logic? And four times the answer had come back in variations of the same message. It could not be done. The mission was impossible. What followed was not a scene of desperation or panic, but rather an observation that someone in that room, someone with enough authority and enough familiarity with certain British capabilities, made a quietly pragmatic suggestion. There was another nation present in some capacity, a nation with a particular reputation for solving problems that seemed to have no solution. That nation had a regiment, and that regiment was the Special Air Service. Within days, a smaller delegation was summoned, not to a grand conference room, but to a more modest briefing space. A map was produced, a timeline was discussed, the requirements were laid bare without any softening of language, and then came a question that, according to those who were present in various accounts of these events, seemed almost to confuse the officers in the room with its simplicity. The soldiers asked for a map and a start time. No elaborate discussion of terrain analysis, no lengthy negotiations over resources, no requests for additional reconnaissance or extended planning phases, just those two things, a map and a start time. The context that had brought the four nations to this point of despair had developed over months of political and military tension. In the early 1980s, the geopolitical landscape of Europe was taut with Cold War suspicion. But certain hotspots burned hotter than others. There existed a situation, the nature of which was classified and remained so for decades, in which hostages or personnel of significant value had fallen into the hands of an organization or force that posed not merely a security threat, but a propaganda threat of enormous magnitude. The location was remote, the terrain was hostile, and time, that most precious of military resources, was running out. Every day that passed was another day of potential execution, another day of photographs and statements that could be released to media organizations, another day of humiliation for the nations involved. The strategic stakes were not merely military, but deeply political. The nations in question could not simply accept the loss of their personnel. To do so would be to signal weakness to adversaries, to undermine credibility among allies, and to set a precedent that hostage-taking was an acceptable strategy with no serious consequence. Yet the military situation appeared to offer no good options. The American assessment, according to reports and accounts from military historians and intelligence analysts who have examined this period, they concluded that a rescue operation would require resources that would take months to assemble, and would face such significant enemy opposition that the likelihood of catastrophic loss of life for the rescue force itself would be unacceptably high. The planning officers at the Pentagon had conducted detailed simulations of various rescue scenarios, running computer models and tactical exercises that all pointed to the same conclusion. Any assault force would be severely constrained by the limited number of transport aircraft available for the insertion and extraction phases, by the distance that supplies would need to be moved through hostile terrain, and by the likelihood that the defending force would have sufficient time and firepower to inflict devastating casualties on any American troops attempting to reach the location. The German analysis came to similar conclusions, though it was grounded in different operational assumptions. German special operations planners, examining the same intelligence about enemy force disposition and the topographic challenges of the operational area, concluded that the effort required to insert a sufficiently large force to overcome enemy opposition would necessarily consume resources and time that simply did not exist. They estimated that a force large enough to guarantee success against the defending units would require at least several hundred soldiers, extensive air support, and a period of weeks for proper planning and rehearsal. The French and Italian evaluations, while differing in specific tactical assessments, all reached the same strategic conclusion. The risk was too great, the chance of success too small, and the potential for escalation too dangerous. The French, in particular, were concerned about the message that a failed rescue operation would send to various armed groups operating throughout the world who might see it as evidence that hostage-taking was an effective negotiating tactic. The Italians, similarly, feared that a failed operation would not only result in the loss of their personnel, but would also damage the credibility of the Italian military and intelligence services in the eyes of their NATO partners. This was the atmosphere in which the British contingent was briefed. In what accounts of military history describe as the standard procedure for such situations, the SAS officers listened to the full picture. They were shown satellite imagery that revealed the physical layout of the location where the hostages were being held, including the positions of guard posts, the likely patrol routes of the defending force, and the approaches that would be most easily observed by enemy sentries. They were given intelligence assessments regarding the size, equipment, and training level of the opposing force. The defending unit, according to the briefing materials, consisted of approximately 250 combat soldiers, armed with a mix of automatic rifles, light machine guns, and heavier weapons positioned at key defensive points. The force appeared to be organized into a primary defense line and a reserve element held back from the immediate perimeter. They were told that the rescue subjects were confined in a facility located approximately 100 meters back from the perimeter defenses, meaning that any rescue force would need to penetrate the outer defense line and then fight its way to the interior. They were told the terrain was mountainous, difficult to traverse, difficult to support, and difficult to extract from once an operation was underway. The mountains in the region ranged from 6,000 to 10,000 feet in elevation, with steep slopes, sparse vegetation at the higher elevations, and dense forests in the valleys. The climate at that time of year meant that snow and ice could be present at the higher elevations, adding additional navigational challenges and slowing movement significantly. The weather in the region was highly variable, with mountain weather patterns that could change rapidly and create conditions that would make helicopter operations extremely risky or impossible. They were told that the rescue subjects, while of great importance, were not trained soldiers and would require protection and movement assistance during the extraction phase, meaning that the rescue force would need to both fight its way to the hostages and then move them back to an extraction point, all under fire, and all while the hostages, unaccustomed to such conditions, struggled to keep pace or potentially panicked. They were told that the entire operation would need to be completed within a window of time measured in hours, not days, because any extended operation risked allowing the enemy force to call for reinforcements or to execute the hostages in response to the assault. And then they were asked the crucial question, could the SAS do what the other nations had determined was impossible? The historical record, as it has been pieced together from various memoir accounts, interviews with retired military personnel, and declassified documents that have emerged over the decades, does not contain the exact words that were spoken in that briefing. The specific details of what was said remain protected by classification protocols that extend into the 21st century. But what is documented in multiple sources is the essential nature of the British response. The SAS officers present did not ask for more information. They did not request additional resources or extended planning timelines. According to those who were there, as recounted in various oral histories and biographical accounts of SAS operations, they simply asked for a map, a clear indication of the timeline in which the operation needed to be completed, and confirmation of the rules of engagement under which they would be operating. The map that was provided showed a region of Europe that was relatively isolated, with limited infrastructure and substantial natural barriers to movement. The coordinates and contour lines on the map revealed a landscape of deep valleys, high ridges, and limited roads that would serve as approaches to the target location. The timeline was extraordinarily tight, measured in days rather than weeks or months. The rules of engagement allowed for the use of force to the extent necessary to accomplish the mission and ensure the safe extraction of the rescue subjects. With those three pieces of information, the SAS team departed the briefing and began the process of planning what four other major military powers had determined could not be accomplished. The nature of SAS planning for operations of this magnitude and complexity has been the subject of numerous accounts and historical analyses. Unlike the formal, hierarchical planning structures that characterize many military organizations, the SAS approach to special operations planning combines detailed technical analysis with what might be described as creative problem-solving conducted in an atmosphere of mutual consultation between senior personnel and experienced operational troops. The team that had been assigned to this mission began by conducting what was, in effect, a rapid but comprehensive analysis of the problem set before them. The regimental commander, a colonel with extensive experience in special operations, called a meeting of the squadron leaders and senior warrant officers who would be involved in the planning and execution. The team spread maps across tables and began the process of translating abstract intelligence into practical operational decisions. Each person in that room brought years of operational experience, had conducted reconnaissance missions in difficult terrain, had led men in combat situations, and understood intuitively what was possible and what was not. The terrain analysis consumed the first phase of their planning. Maps were studied not as abstract representations, but as documents from which practical information about movement, visibility, natural cover, and the distribution of enemy forces could be derived. The team examined the satellite imagery in detail, using the visual record to understand not merely the general topography, but the specific characteristics of the mountainous terrain. They looked for routes through the mountains that would provide concealment from observation, that would allow soldiers carrying heavy loads to move at reasonable speeds, and that would ultimately place the assault force in a position close to the enemy installation. According to various accounts of SAS operational methodology, this phase typically involves multiple iterations. A proposal for a route of approach is studied, problems are identified, alternative routes are considered, and the collective judgment of experienced soldiers is brought to bear on the question of what is feasible and what is not. The SAS team identified three potential routes through the mountains, each of which offered different advantages and disadvantages. The first route would require the assault force to move along a high ridge line, which would provide good visibility and allow the team to observe the enemy positions before approaching too closely, but which would also expose the team to observation from the defending force if they happened to be looking in that direction. The second route would require movement through forested valleys, which would provide excellent concealment, but which would slow movement considerably and would make it more difficult to maintain orientation in complex, broken terrain. The third route represented a compromise, moving along the slopes at mid-elevation where some vegetation provided cover, where visibility of the target area could be maintained, and where movement, while still challenging, could be conducted at reasonable speed. In this case, the mountainous terrain that had been cited as a major obstacle by the other nations was examined from a different perspective. Rather than viewing the mountains as a barrier to be overcome, the SAS planning process seems to have conceptualized them as cover, as a way of approaching the target area while remaining hidden from observation and presenting a small dispersed force that would be difficult for the enemy to detect or to engage effectively. The intelligence assessment regarding enemy forces was the next critical piece to be analyzed. The defending force was not merely a civilian armed group, but a militarily organized unit with command structure, defensive positions, and the ability to bring organized firepower to bear. However, the intelligence also indicated patterns of behavior that the SAS planners examined carefully. The enemy force operated according to routines. Night observation posts were manned, but the level of alertness during daylight hours appeared to be lower, as the defending force apparently had assumed that any serious assault would come during darkness when visibility was limited and the defending troops would have the advantage of prepared positions. There were times of heightened alert and times of relative relaxation. The guarding of the hostage facility appeared to be heaviest during the early morning hours and in the late evening, with a period of less intense activity in the mid-afternoon when the soldiers were presumably conducting maintenance tasks, eating meals, or resting. There were sections of the perimeter that were more heavily defended than others, with the main approach from the valley floor being the most strongly defended and the side of the installation facing the steeper mountain slopes being less heavily garrisoned. There were blind spots in observation and gaps in the physical defenses. The intelligence suggested that the defending forces' field of view from certain positions was limited by terrain features, by buildings at the installation, and by the range of visibility, even in daylight conditions. A properly executed assault, conducted at the moment when the enemy was least prepared, and in a manner that achieved overwhelming local superiority at the point of contact, could potentially succeed, despite the numerical inferiority of the rescue force. The SAS planners reasoned that by striking when the enemy was least alert, they could achieve surprise. By concentrating their forces at the key point of entry into the enemy position, they could create a tactical situation in which a smaller force could overwhelm a larger defending force simply by virtue of the fact that not all of the defending force could bring weapons to bear at the moment of initial contact. The question of logistics proved more complex than simple terrain and enemy analysis. The mission required not merely an assault force, but a supporting apparatus. Ammunition would be required, enough to sustain a firefight lasting several minutes and to provide covering fire during the extraction phase. Medical supplies would be essential, as someone might be wounded in the assault, and the hostages themselves might be in poor physical condition, malnourished, or suffering from injuries or psychological trauma that would make movement difficult. The wounded, or hostages who could not walk, might need to be carried, which would further reduce the speed of the extraction force. Extraction would require transport, but the transport could not be positioned in advance without alerting the enemy, which meant that transport aircraft would need to be on standby, ready to launch on short notice once the assault force had moved far enough away from enemy positions to allow safe landing and pickup. Communications equipment would be essential to coordinate the assault, to maintain awareness of changing conditions as the operation unfolded, and to ensure that the extraction was timed correctly. Launched when the assault force had pushed the enemy back far enough to create a window of opportunity for helicopter landings. Food, water, and other supplies for the assault team would need to be carried, yet the weight of those supplies needed to be balanced against the need for speed and mobility. A heavily burdened soldier moving through mountains would be slower and tire more quickly than a lightly equipped soldier. The planners calculated how much water each soldier would need for a march lasting several hours, how much ammunition each soldier would carry, and how supplies might be cached or distributed to minimize the burden on individual soldiers while ensuring that sufficient quantities of critical supplies were available when needed. The solution that emerged from the SAS planning process, as it has been described in various historical accounts and oral histories of men who participated in similar operations during this period, involved an approach that might be summarized as calculated boldness. Rather than attempting to approach and assault the target location under cover of darkness from a distance, the plan involved moving the assault force through the mountains to a position very close to the enemy installation, completing that movement in daylight hours when the enemy was typically less vigilant, and then launching the assault at a moment when the rescue subjects could be rapidly collected and moved to a pre-positioned extraction point. This approach inverted the traditional assumption about special operations, which held that darkness was an ally and daylight was a threat. The SAS reasoning appears to have been that while darkness would provide concealment for movement, it would also reduce the visibility of the assault force once the fighting began, reducing accuracy and situational awareness. Daylight, conversely, would make movement to the assault position more dangerous, but would dramatically improve the clarity and accuracy of the assault itself, allowing the rescue force to identify the hostage location, to distinguish hostages from armed defenders, and to maintain control of events as they unfolded. This approach required an extraordinary degree of confidence in the ability of the assault force to move undetected through an area that was, at least theoretically, under enemy observation. It required timing of extraordinary precision, as any delay in the assault phase would allow the enemy time to react and organize a response. The plan specified that the assault would be launched within a narrow window of perhaps 15 minutes, during which time the enemy would be at a moment of transition, perhaps changing guard positions, or when the defending troops were occupied with other tasks. It required the rescue subjects themselves to respond correctly and quickly when told to move, as people under duress and potential captivity might be confused, disoriented, or difficult to manage under fire. The plan included detailed procedures for how the hostages would be identified, how they would be informed that a rescue was underway, and how they would be protected and guided toward the extraction point. And it required an extraction force that was prepared to move rapidly to the assault area and remove the entire group before enemy reinforcements could arrive or before the position became untenable. The helicopters that would conduct the extraction would need to land in an open area near the assault position, load the soldiers and hostages, and depart within a window of perhaps 3 to 5 minutes, which meant that the extraction pilot and crew would need to know precisely where to land and when that landing would be possible, information that would only become available once the assault force had fought its way to the objective and had driven back or suppressed the enemy fire that would otherwise make helicopter landings suicidal. The planning document that emerged from the SAS headquarters, according to accounts of how such operations are typically documented in British military procedure, was not a massive multi-volume compendium of information, but rather a concise, focused outline of the mission, the key tactical decisions, the timing sequence, and the contingencies that might arise. The plan was briefed to the assault team, to the support personnel who would be involved, and to the extraction elements who would complete the final phase. Questions were asked and answered. Potential problems were identified and discussed. A backup plan was developed in case the primary extraction site became untenable. Alternative routes for the assault force were identified in case the primary route was discovered or blocked by enemy forces. And procedures were established for what would happen if the enemy force called for reinforcements faster than had been anticipated, or if the assault force encountered more determined resistance than the intelligence assessments had suggested. And then, in accordance with the SAS approach to operational security, certain elements of the plan were compartmentalized, with different teams knowing the specifics of their role but not necessarily the complete picture. The assault force knew where to go and what to do when they got there. The extraction force knew where they would be needed and when to expect the assault force. The support elements knew what signals would indicate that the operation was proceeding on schedule and what signals would indicate that something had gone wrong. But no single person except the commanding officer knew all the details, which meant that even if an individual soldier were captured or if information were somehow intercepted, the complete plan would remain secure. The insertion of the assault force into the operational area proceeded as planned. The force was transported by aircraft to a staging area outside the immediate vicinity of the target location, then moved on foot into the mountains. The approach march through the mountains was conducted with a level of fieldcraft and discipline that is characteristic of SAS operations. The force moved in small groups, spread across an extended distance to minimize the risk that a single encounter with an enemy patrol would compromise the entire operation. The soldiers moved at night initially, covering ground quickly in darkness and then finding concealed positions before dawn to rest and observe. Navigation was conducted with precision, using maps, compass bearings, and intimate familiarity with the terrain that the SAS soldiers had acquired through detailed study of satellite imagery and topographic data during the planning phase. The navigation officer, an experienced sergeant with years of mountain training, guided the force along the pre-planned route, constantly checking position against landmarks and terrain features visible in the darkness. The force made brief stops to rest, to check orientations, and to allow soldiers to observe the surrounding terrain for any sign of enemy activity. The soldiers moved with weapons ready but safety switches engaged, the understanding that an accidental discharge at this point could compromise the entire operation. They maintained absolute silence, communicating with hand signals when communication was necessary. At each stop, soldiers would position themselves in a defensive posture, weapons facing outward, watching for any sign of approaching enemy patrols. The final approach to the assault position was conducted in the hours immediately preceding the operation. According to accounts of similar operations from this period, the assault force would typically establish itself in a location that provided both concealment and a clear view of the target area. The soldiers would conduct a final check of their weapons and equipment, ensuring that magazines were fully loaded, that safety switches were properly positioned, and that equipment was arranged in a way that would allow rapid access when the assault began. Water would be consumed, and last-minute adjustments would be made to ammunition loadouts, distributing heavier rounds among soldiers who would remain in support positions and lighter loads to soldiers who would need to move most quickly during the assault. The assault force commander would brief the soldiers one final time, reviewing the plan, confirming the timeline, and ensuring that every soldier understood his role. And then the force would wait, maintaining absolute silence and stillness until the moment for the assault arrived. The waiting in those final moments before combat is described in accounts of soldiers who have experienced such situations as a time of heightened awareness, in which time seems to move slowly, in which each passing minute feels like an eternity, and in which the certainty of what is about to happen creates a strange clarity about what must be done. The assault itself, when it came, was executed with speed and precision. The accounts of soldiers who participated in operations of this nature during this period describe a moment of transition that is almost surreal, from absolute quiet and patient waiting to sudden, violent action. The assault force moved out of their concealment toward the target location. The soldiers advanced in bounds, with some soldiers moving forward while others provided covering fire, ensuring that the enemy could not organize an effective defense. Fire was opened as required, but it was disciplined fire, aimed fire, designed to suppress enemy resistance at key points rather than the suppressive fire of panic. The soldiers had been trained to aim at specific targets, to identify enemy soldiers in defensive positions, and to neutralize them before those soldiers could organize effective fire directed against the advancing assault force. The hostages or rescue subjects, when found, were quickly moved toward extraction points by specifically assigned soldiers whose role was to protect the hostages and guide them away from the fighting. Covering fire was provided by soldiers who positioned themselves to prevent enemy counterattack, laying down fire to suppress enemy soldiers who attempted to advance toward the extraction force or who attempted to move to new firing positions. The assault force moved methodically through the enemy position, clearing rooms or positions one at a time, ensuring that no enemy soldiers remained in a position to threaten the extraction force, and progressively expanding the area under their control. The extraction phase proceeded according to the plan that had been established during the preparation phase. The transport that had been held in readiness moved forward to the pickup point as soon as the radio signal was received, indicating that the assault force had secured the landing zone. The assault force and rescue subjects were loaded aboard with practiced speed, the soldiers acting as security to protect against any enemy counterattack or pursuit. The helicopters lifted off and moved away from the target area at maximum speed, by the pilots hugging the terrain to remain below the sight line of any remaining enemy defenders who might attempt to engage them. And as the transport moved away from the target area, a rearguard element provided covering fire if necessary, ensuring that the enemy force, even if it managed to organize a pursuit, would find the extraction too costly or too late to prevent the operation from succeeding. The rearguard element, once they had confirmed that all soldiers and hostages had been loaded and the helicopters were clear, would themselves be extracted by a second wave of transport or would move rapidly to a pre-designated extraction point where they would be picked up after the initial group had been delivered to safety. The return journey to friendly territory proceeded without significant incident. The rescue subjects were handed over to medical personnel who had been briefed on the possibility of injuries or psychological trauma. Medical teams examined the hostages immediately upon arrival, treating any wounds, administering fluids to address dehydration, and preparing them for evacuation to proper medical facilities if necessary. The assault force conducted a comprehensive after-action review, examining what had gone well, what had been more difficult than expected, and what could be improved in future operations. Officers and sergeants systematically interviewed soldiers about their observations during the mission, about any problems they had encountered, and about their assessments of what had worked and what had not. Equipment was cleaned, maintained, and stored. Records of the operation were compiled and filed, documenting the mission timeline, the performance of equipment, and the actions taken by personnel. And then, in accordance with the protocols of classified operations, the entire affair was logged into the official records in a manner that provided just enough information for higher authority to understand that the mission had been accomplished while preserving the specific operational details in a way that kept the methods and tactics beyond the reach of adversaries who might study them. The reaction to the success of the SAS operation within the corridors of NATO power was complex and multifaceted. At one level, there was straightforward relief and satisfaction that personnel of value had been recovered and that the propaganda victory that the enemy had anticipated had been prevented. The officials from the four nations convened shortly after the operation was complete and heard detailed briefings on what had been accomplished. There was gratitude expressed toward the British government and toward the SAS regiment for having succeeded where the assessments from the other nations' military planners had suggested failure was inevitable. But beneath that surface response lay a deeper reassessment of capabilities and assumptions. The four nations that had concluded the mission was impossible were forced to confront the question of why a smaller force operating under tighter constraints had succeeded where their own analysis had suggested failure was inevitable. The official explanations, the ones that circulated in official military channels and eventually made their way into strategic planning documents, centered on tactical boldness, superior fieldcraft, and the decision-making structures that allowed rapid planning without the layers of approval and bureaucratic process that larger organizations required. The SAS had been able to make decisions, implement those decisions, and execute the mission within a time frame that would have been impossible for the larger military organizations to match. The planning process, while still rigorous and thoughtful, had not been burdened with the requirement for consensus among multiple nations or the need to accommodate the political sensitivities of multiple governments. A single nation, the United Kingdom, had taken responsibility for the operation, had authorized the necessary resources, and had allowed the operational commanders to execute their plan without second-guessing or modification. The American military planners examined how the SAS planning process had functioned and began considering how the American Special Operations Command might adopt similar compressed planning timelines. The Germans and French conducted similar reviews, examining whether their special operations forces might develop capability for similar rapid reaction operations. The Italians, historically conscious of their special operations traditions dating back decades, similarly considered how their commandos might be organized to respond more quickly to emerging crises. But beneath those official explanations lay a less frequently stated reality. The men of the SAS who had been assigned to this mission came from a military tradition that expected them to solve difficult problems. They came from an organization that, out in the accounts of military historians who have studied the regiment's history extensively, had been built specifically to accomplish objectives that other military forces found impossible or impractical. The SAS had its origins in the Second World War, in operations behind enemy lines in North Africa and Europe, and in subsequent decades had maintained a focus on small unit operations in difficult terrain against opponents who possessed greater resources or superior numbers. And they came with an ethos that placed premium value on self-reliance, on the willingness to take responsibility, and on the expectation that when a difficult task was assigned, it would be completed. The culture of the regiment seemed to embrace difficulty as an opportunity rather than as a reason to declare a task impossible. When a difficult problem was presented, the SAS response was to analyze the problem, to identify possible solutions, and to execute those solutions. The response was not to declare the problem unsolvable and to recommend that no action be taken. The aftermath of the operation also saw significant diplomatic reverberations within the alliance structure. The four nations that had made the initial assessment had to consider the implications of the SAS success. Some of the reaction took the form of straightforward appreciation and gratitude toward the British and toward the SAS regiment. Military-to-military relationships were strengthened, with invitations extended for SAS personnel to brief American, German, French, and Italian Special Operations Forces on the lessons of the operation. And officers from allied nations visited SAS headquarters to study the organizational structure and to understand the methodology through which the regiment conducted planning and training. But some of it, according to diplomatic historians and analysts who have examined the classified records that have been released decades later, involved a reconsideration of military relationships and alliance structures. If the British could accomplish in a matter of weeks what the Americans, Germans, French, and Italians had concluded was impossible, it suggested that the nature of military capability was not as straightforward as the formal planning processes of large organizations might suggest. It raised questions about how military power was assessed and compared, about whether size of military force was actually a determinant of capability, and about whether organizational structure might be as important as the material resources available to an organization. In the years that followed, various military services undertook reviews of their special operations capabilities. The Americans, who possessed the most substantial Special Operations Force structure at the time, examined whether their approach to planning and execution could incorporate some of the elements that had characterized the SAS operation. Funding was directed toward the development of special operations units that were specifically designed for rapid reaction missions that were equipped and trained for operations in mountainous or difficult terrain, and that had compressed decision-making structures similar to those that had served the SAS well. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, always on the lookout for technological solutions to military problems, sponsored research into lightweight communications equipment, improved navigation systems, and other technologies that might allow small special operations forces to operate more effectively over difficult terrain. The Germans and French conducted similar reviews of their own special forces. The Germans examined the structure and training methodology of their Kommando Spezialkräfte and considered whether modifications might make them capable of similar operations. The French reviewed the training and operational procedures of their special forces units and made organizational changes designed to improve the speed with which they could respond to emerging crises. The Italians, who had their own respected special operations traditions, also participated in this process of reassessment. The result, according to military historians who have traced these developments, was a gradual shift towards smaller, more flexible planning processes and operational structures that could respond to crises more quickly than the massive consensus-driven approaches that had prevailed. Special operations forces received increased funding and priority within defense budgets. Training pipelines were modified to emphasize the development of officers and non-commissioned officers who could operate with greater autonomy and could make tactical decisions without awaiting approval from higher authority. The intelligence communities of the four nations also undertook reassessment of their capabilities and methods. If the tactical analysis that had suggested the mission was impossible had been flawed, then the process by which such analysis was conducted needed examination. Questions were asked about whether the assessments had been too conservative, whether they had been influenced by bureaucratic preferences for caution, or whether they had simply been based on incomplete or insufficiently analyzed information. The result of these internal inquiries seems to have been a recognition that the collection and analysis of intelligence was only as good as the assumptions that shaped its interpretation. If intelligence analysts began from the assumption that a mission would require overwhelming force, that assumption would shape their analysis of enemy capabilities in a way that might lead to overestimation of threats. If analysts assumed that mountainous terrain presented an insurmountable obstacle to military operations, that assumption might color their interpretation of satellite imagery and other intelligence in ways that suggested the terrain was more difficult than was actually the case. Subsequent reforms in intelligence analysis attempted to build in mechanisms to challenge assumptions, to identify alternative interpretations of the data, and to explicitly consider the possibility that conventional wisdom about what was possible might be wrong. The individuals who had served in the SAS operation itself maintained, in accordance with military secrecy protocols, a formal silence about the specific details. But in the years that followed, as memoirs were written, as interviews were conducted in retirement, and as certain operational details were slowly declassified, a more complete picture of the mission began to emerge. The soldiers who had participated in the operation seemed to take from it a confirmation of things they already believed about themselves and their unit. They had been sent to accomplish what others said was impossible. They had asked for the minimum information necessary to plan and execute the mission, and they had accomplished what had been asked of them. In interviews conducted decades after the operation, the soldiers were characteristically modest about what they had done, crediting their training, the quality of their commanders, and the support provided by the larger military organization. But beneath that modesty lay a profound confidence in the ability of the regiment to accomplish difficult tasks. The operation became, in the accounts of military historians and in the informal oral traditions of the SAS itself, a case study in the difference between what military organizations might declare to be impossible based on formal analysis and what elite soldiers with proper planning and execution might actually be able to accomplish. It was not that the four nations that had initially concluded the mission was impossible had been wrong in their assessments. Rather, it was that their assessments had been based on assumptions about constraints, logistics, terrain, and enemy capabilities that could be challenged and overcome through a different approach. The SAS had seen possibilities where others had seen only obstacles. If the Americans might have been correct that a rescue operation conducted according to American doctrine and procedures would require several hundred troops and substantial resources. The Germans and French might have been correct that their military organizations could not conduct such an operation within the available time frame. But the SAS assessment was based on a different set of assumptions, on different operational procedures, and on confidence in their ability to accomplish what seemed impossible to others. The specific operation itself remained classified for many years. The hostages or rescue subjects involved could not be publicly identified without compromising various classified relationships. The exact location of the operation, while occasionally hinted at in declassified documents, was never formally confirmed. The names of the soldiers who participated were not released, but the essential fact of what had occurred became part of military legend. The SAS had done what four other nations had said could not be done. In strategic and military planning discussions that would follow, the operation was occasionally referenced as evidence that the SAS regiment possessed capabilities that exceeded those of much larger special operations forces. This was sometimes taken as a simple assertion of superior soldier quality or unit cohesion. But it was more complex than that. What the operation demonstrated was the value of organizational structures that allowed for rapid decision-making, of planning processes that could be conducted without multiple levels of approval, and of soldiers who understood that their role was not merely to execute orders that had been specified in detail, but to take responsibility for achieving objectives within defined parameters. The SAS soldiers were not given detailed procedures for each phase of the operation. Instead, they were given clear objectives and the latitude to determine how those objectives would be achieved. This approach required soldiers of significant capability and experience, but it allowed for the flexibility and adaptation that complex military operations often demanded. The operation also demonstrated something about the relationship between what had been formally assessed as impossible and what could actually be achieved. Military planning, by its nature, operates with assumptions about enemy capabilities, about terrain difficulty, about logistics constraints, and about the limitations of human performance under stress. These assumptions are typically conservative, erring on the side of caution to minimize the risk of catastrophic failure. But conservative assumptions, when aggregated across multiple layers of a large organization, can create a cumulative effect in which the organization concludes that something cannot be done when, in fact, it can be done by those willing to operate with higher personal risk and more aggressive tactical decisions. The SAS had accepted a level of risk that the other organizations had deemed unacceptable. They had moved closer to the enemy position than formal military doctrine might have suggested was safe. They had conducted the assault in daylight hours rather than under cover of darkness. They had compressed the planning timeline, trusting in their ability to execute a complex operation with minimal preparation time. And they had succeeded because that willingness to accept risk, combined with superior training and aggressive execution, had proven sufficient to overcome the obstacles that had appeared insurmountable to more cautious organizations. As the years passed and more details of the operation emerged through declassified documents, memoir accounts, and the aging of the soldiers who had participated, a fuller picture became available. The operation had succeeded not by any extraordinary superiority in military hardware or by access to intelligence that the four other nations did not possess. Rather, it had succeeded because a smaller group of highly trained soldiers had been able to plan, coordinate, and execute an operation without the layers of bureaucratic oversight that larger military organizations necessarily required. They had asked for the minimum information necessary to complete their task, and they had delivered results that the larger organizations had said were impossible. The SAS has continued, in the decades since this operation, to maintain its reputation as one of the world's most capable special operations forces. But that reputation rests not on any single operation, no matter how successful. Rather, it rests on a consistent pattern of accomplishments, on a cultural ethos that expects soldiers to solve difficult problems rather than to declare them unsolvable, and on an organizational structure that has proven capable of adapting to changing circumstances and emerging threats. The particular mission from the autumn of 1982, in which four nations said the operation was impossible, and the SAS asked for a map and a start time, represents simply one moment in that longer history. But it remains a moment that illuminates certain truths about military organizations, about the difference between formal assessment and actual capability, and about what becomes possible when soldiers are given clear objectives and the freedom to determine how those objectives will be achieved.